Hi, everyone. Welcome to this event with Mott's Climate Collective, where we'll be talking with Ashish Ghadiali of Wretched of the Earth and Penny Wangari-Jones of the Racial Justice Network, both UK-based organizations working at the intersections of climate, environment, and social justice, as well as in the arts and culture more broadly. I'm TJ Demos, based at UC Santa Cruz and director of the Center for Creative Ecologies, as well as the chair of the Climate Collective. And I'm joined by my colleagues, Molemo Moiloa, Johannesburg-based creative practitioner and community organizer, and Paulo Tavares, a Brasilia-based architect and spatial politics researcher. Our other member, Susan Shupley, the London-based documentary film of Center for Research Architecture, is unfortunately unable to join us today. So bringing urgent focus to climate emergency, and first convened in early 2021, Mott's Climate Collective energizes critical analyses and creative proposals in moving beyond catastrophism and toward the emergence of environmentally sustainable and socially just futures. Interdisciplinary in breadth and international in scope. Our program, which you can find online on Mott's website, assembles diverse cultural practitioners working at the intersection of experimental arts and political ecology in a year-long project of collective deliberation. The goal is to unveil horizons of thought and action vital for a livable future, dedicated to unpacking the complexities, both socioeconomic and juridical, political, also techno-environmental and cultural, of current climate transformation. For our event today, we'll first hear from Ash and Penny about their organizations and recent activities, and then have a discussion about current challenges and ways of approaching climate emergency. So just a little bit more by way of introduction. Wretched of the Earth is a grassroots collective for Indigenous, Black, Brown, and diaspora groups and individuals demanding climate justice and acting in solidarity with communities both in the UK and in the global South. They wrote the widely cited open letter to Extinction Rebellion, the environmentalist organization, in 2019, in which they explain that the bleakness of our present climate emergency is not something of the future. For those of us who are Indigenous, working class, Black, Brown, queer, trans, or disabled, the experience of structural violence became part of our birthright. Greta Thunberg calls world leaders to act by reminding them that our house is on fire. But for many of us, they write, the house has been on fire for a long time. Whenever the tide of ecological violence rises, our communities, especially in the global South, are always hit first. We are the first to face poor air quality, hunger, public health crises, drought, floods, and displacement. They continue to say, in order to envision a future in which we will all be liberated from the root causes of the climate crisis, including capitalism, extractivism, racism, sexism, classism, ableism, and other systems of oppression. The climate movement must first reflect the complex realities of everyone's lives in their narrative. So that's Wretched of the Earth. Racial Justice Network, based in the UK, brings together individuals, communities, and organizations from across West Yorkshire to promote racial justice and propose holistic, economic, spiritual, and cultural repairs to end socio-environmental injustice and address the legacies of colonialism, including via its proposed 13th recommendation, which was made in relation to the city of Leeds and their climate policy in 2020, in which they encourage Leeds to act local and think global, particularly in relation to colonial legacies and the climate debt owed to the majority world from exploiting countries, including the UK. Also included in the 13th recommendation, they write, international perspectives on climate justice are needed, and the many solutions already being modeled by frontline activists and communities in the majority world. We also need climate action as climate justice, as social justice, stressing the interconnectedness of oppressions and struggles, specifically of race and class, gender, migration, and geography. They also demand solidarity to Indigenous, Black, and Brown communities whose livelihood, land, and lives are disproportionately threatened by the destructive neo-colonial practices of extractive industry and multinational corporations, and also solidarity to all those facing the brutality of Fortress Europe, the hostile environment, which I hope we'll hear more about and talk about, and the institutionally racist security, prison, and policing infrastructure. That's all included in the 13th recommendation of Racial Justice Network. So for this virtual gathering, we'll be discussing the meaning and necessity and challenges of climate justice within the cultural and artistic sphere and within public policy and community activism. Also in advance of COP26, the 26th UN Climate Change Conference of the parties meeting this year in Glasgow from October 31st to November 12th, which brings parties together to accelerate action towards the goals of the Paris Agreement and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So thank you so much for everyone for joining us. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. I wish it could be in person. I look forward to the conversation with everyone. And I'll now hand it over to Ash for a brief presentation from the perspective of Wretched of the Earth, and then over to Penny of the Racial Justice Network. So Ash, welcome.
Thanks a lot, TJ. And yeah, no, I really appreciate the invitation. It's good to be here with you all. I mean, so I guess, like, you know, the current context in the UK is that you know, the intergovernmental conversation, like, you know, the COP26 like will take place in Glasgow in about a month's time, and I think that for, you know, a kind of radical decolonial you know, collective, like, organizing around climate justice, it's I guess that's created a kind of the space for kind of ongoing discussion, I guess, really, and reflection about agency. You know, like what, like that event is coming, you know, poses all kinds of questions for organizers about, you know, how much to organize in relation to that event and how much to stand apart from it. I think that as a collective, and obviously that all of that's kind of been completely shaped by the context of a pandemic. So obviously COP26 was supposed to happen in Glasgow in November 2020, and the COP26 coalition, which is, you know, one of the key organizers of that is Asad Rehman, who's also executive director of War on Want, and you know, part of the coordinating committee of the COP26 Civil Society Coalition and a co-founder of Wretched of the Earth. You know, so the conversation was in Wretched of the Earth from as early as, you know, kind of January, February 2020. You know, are we going to get involved? Do we get involved collectively? Lots of people are getting involved within the collective, individually or through the organizations that they work for. I don't, and so that's been going on now for, that was, you know, initially intended as a conversation that would like last 9 months, and it's essentially been a 2-year kind of process. I don't think that we've necessarily landed a singular answer. Obviously, the pandemic itself has thrown up all different kinds of challenges. Obviously, the challenge of not being able to sit together, eat together, you know, meet the way that, like, we had, you know, been used to meeting. But then also, like, you know, what constituted a kind of the priority, right? So that, you know, lots of members of Wretched of the Earth have been, you know, really involved in housing action, in rent solidarity, in you know, support for undocumented migrants in their local communities. That might be the Latinx community, or more, or it might be kind of wider than that. Others, you know, and I was one of the people that actually did then get very involved in the COP26 civil society coalition, and actually found myself kind of engaging with that space, which I hadn't done previously, and kind of, you know, and found myself increasingly concerned with the question of, you know, like, actually, what does the critique that we've laid out in the open letter to Extinction Rebellion that many people read, like, what does that actually translate into in terms of, you know, global or planetary strategy? You know, like what, you know, what does that mean in terms, you know, at the kind of domestic policy level? And I think, you know, yeah, so it's been diverse, the kind of the response and the approach, and you know, there are some actions that we are now sort of focused on. So, you know, Wretched of the Earth will be involved in the COP26 coalition's climate block. On, you know, there'll be a kind of a global solidarity march on, decentered global solidarity march on November the 6th. We'll be holding, you know, actions looking at kind of issues of reparations in relation to Lloyd's of London on the 29th of October. We'll be holding a kind of a remembrance day. So there's, you know, in the kind of great, you know, warmongering nation, we still honour, you know, lives lost in the First World War more passionately than we do lives that are being lost right now all around us as a result of climate breakdown. So, you know, Wretched of the Earth will be on Remembrance Day, November the 14th, you know, holding a commemoration for lives lost through climate breakdown. So, you know, there has been this kind of collective engagement that has kind of steered towards some kind of positioning in relation to COP26. But, you know, but at a personal level, I've kind of found that these questions have kind of led to, you know, interventions, you know, try to intervene at the level of policy and climate science. I work as activist in residence at UCL and organised the 1.5C Charter earlier in the year, which was a way of kind of thinking through issues at a kind of, you know, at a kind of policy level, and I'm currently organising a symposium in Devon, where I live, that will bring sort of leading decolonial thinkers together, including Paul Gilroy and Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who lives in Lisbon, and you know, Philippe Sands, Alexis Pauline Gums, as well as a kind of whole slew of artists, where we're really, I guess that's kind of actually come out of a kind of yeah, I guess, you know, a kind of questioning of how much genuinely progressive movement is like happening in that intergovernmental space, and a kind of real sense that actually there's deep work of imagination and creativity that really is the path towards a climate just future. So that's a snapshot of what's going on, and, you know, where things are at for us. And I've spoken a lot, and I'm really excited to hear from Penny.
Thank you, Ash, and yeah, thank you, TJ and the team for inviting us to come and share. And yeah, it was kind of good to listen to what it is that we say the 13th is, but also what it is that we say the Racial Justice Network is. And yeah, we are based in the North, and I think in terms of what comes with that, being outside of London, but the issues that we face up here that are a little different. But it's worth just to add on that, yeah, majority of the work that we do, or we are an organization that focuses on race, or at least increasing race literacy, which we understand has been a very intentional effort by the systems and the powers that be to take away not just the structures, but ability for people to really understand. So we focus on race and how race intersects with other oppressions and identities, i.e. class, migration, gender, sexuality, faith, and all of those things. And that has given us not just a unique position in terms of being able to understand issues kind of on a multifaceted point of view, it's also been our key strength, because being able to kind of give the lens, the race lens, the colonial lens as well, to a lot of those issues that people are facing elsewhere has meant we're able to also build solidarities across, for example, organizations that are working predominantly on sexuality, for example, or on gender or on climate, that have this other side. Our purpose and our mission is really to kind of bring that in, as well as other issues like anti-Blackness. But the idea of the colonial legacies being really key, because that is the power, the kind of the global power or the driver of not just the coloniality that we continue to experience now, but the global inequalities that we have, and the role that capitalism has played in all of this. And in a way, it's also allowed for us not to center communities who are most marginalized or individuals who are most marginalized, and in a way avoid this whole concept of whataboutism, or what about this and what about that, because if we kind of bring and have this lens or way of looking at things from multiple views and multiple angles and understanding the oppressions and intersections as they exist or interlink, how everything interlinks, we're least likely to leave anybody behind. And as you shared about the 13th, it did emerge out of frustration. And I think a lot of the work that we do as an organization, but I know is also personal, as most of us are, in terms of what drives us, what got us to do what it is that we do. I particularly share the fact that I was born and bred in Kenya. And so the climate perspective kind of comes with other angles too, of what I grew up seeing around me, what I understand, but also how the not just the invisibility of the knowledges, or what we kind of see as epistemicide, the knowledges that exist in those communities who are most connected to the land, who have done the least damage to climate, how they're not even being perceived as either knowing, but also not being consulted, and also having people kind of Eurocentric views and perspectives going in to teach, even though they're the ones who've also done the most damage. So for me, it comes from that perspective. And on a Leeds or kind of West Yorkshire perspective, is seeing, especially now that there's more talk about, especially talking about the crisis, and it was really good to see, kind of read and see the letter that was written, that saying that we've been burning for a while. The crisis is not just landed now, it's been here, and some of us and some of our communities and ancestors have suffered from it. So it's understanding that, and understanding how even right now there's still like what we're seeing as colonialism of climate, because we're leaving the communities out, as if we're able to address climate issues or planet repairs without them. You know, we understand climate, there's no borders, but we also understand that in terms of resources that exist, that there is a disparity of those who are able to deal with what we're seeing as the crisis or the damage that there is right now, and there's those who are not. So those of us who kind of participated in the conversation, because the 13th framework, as we're seeing it, or as we're calling it, is a recipe for how we deal and understand and do anything climate. We've spent lots of times in spaces where we say the spaces are too white, or we need more black and brown faces. And when at the same time we're seeing the politics of representation is not enough, getting us in those rooms, as long as you're not really understanding the perspectives and the journeys and the reasons we're here in the first place, it's not enough to just have us in there. So pushing for perspectives as we did. So once we participated, because the 13th has these 3 tenets of internationalism, colonial legacies, an activist solidarity, because I don't know whether to say it's lucky or unlucky enough to have communities. Most of us who work, because we kind of, our main focus being Black and brown communities, we're in an international organization as well. We know of communities who are dying and defending the land and the planet with their bodies, and nothing being said of it. So we wanted to push for the solidarity that needs to be done. And it's not just the word the blah, blah, blah stuff. It's more being authentic enough and being of consequence too. So that is what kind of led to, once we brought this perspective in the conversation and it was disregarded, we went ahead and created a space to say whose perspectives and are we not listening to. And once we created this framework, which we feel is going to address, or at least addressing some of those concerns, and in a way of even the solutions that are being sought right now, of the, you know, if we want green energy 1.5, whatever, it's still coming at a cost of the global south, whether we're talking about the electric cars, in terms of who's sourcing that cobalt, where is it coming from, who are the bodies that are dying trying to cross and how do we understand that? And I think that was also very key in terms of understanding the interconnectedness of oppression, but of social justice issues. The fact that because of colonialism, there's debt, there's countries who are really poor that are no longer able to address, but also fleeing in terms of economic migrants as well. And what happens when they arrive in Europe? How are they treated? Do we see them as people coming to take from, or do we have a duty to respond to? Do we understand even how consumerism, because I think that's also the other issue we feel like is being not addressed. We talk about manufacturing as an issue around how the damage to the climate, but we don't even understand how consumerism does. So bringing this personal as well as kind of macro issues together and highlighting them has been something that we've done and we're continuing to do with this group, which is the collective. So we have monthly spaces where we learn together. We are also taking this 13th framework to other spaces because we see it as a recipe that will address some of those issues and taking it elsewhere. So, so that's kind of like where we're at with it. And also more recently decided to take on a reparation declaration, which maybe I'll speak more about if a question comes that relates to it. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Penny, and also Ash. That was really, really amazing and filled with insights and important points that I'm sure Paulo and Molemo have questions also about. I'll kick it off and maybe just ask us to step back for a second. In some of our previous conversations, Ash and Penny, one thing we talked about was how both of you really came to think about climate and the climate emergency, not directly through, say, familiar or conventional approaches to environmentalism, but rather through really the urgency of social justice, of anti-racist activism and organizing. And I'm wondering if you can say more about that, about how you came to feel that climate emergency is something that it's important to intervene in and address, but not through the kind of typical abstract statistics of talking about carbon in the atmosphere, but rather focusing on these really powerful histories of environmental destruction, but also the histories of colonial violence and what Penny was alluding to in terms of epistemicide, the destruction of local and traditional knowledges, which are part of the inequality of power more broadly. So if you could talk a little bit more about that, I think it's so important. And I just want to highlight it and hear from both of you. Thank you.
Do you want to go first or shall I? I think I kind of began by, that bit of saying my journey as, you know, born and bred in Kenya, and then and also understanding colonial history from family background of family who participated in the resistance, and then really landing here and feeling the full impact of not just being racialized as Black, even though I knew I was Black, but I kind of really got to know I was, but also as a person who's migrated into the country and what that brought with. So a lot of the other projects that we hold and we have within the Racial Justice Network is looking at migration policies and the hostile environment, particularly in terms of the disparity and the harsh, not just anti-migrant narrative, but what it means to be the kind of the dehumanizing that kind of comes with arriving in this country and seen as if we're coming to take from, as opposed to, as I said before, the West benefited and got wealthy off the backs of our ancestors and extraction and exploitation, and then they have this wealth amassed here. They don't understand how the fact that most people are migrating as a result of the poison and the damage that was instigated via that vehicle, and how what that means. So so by being here and understanding this and understanding what kind of employment, the criminal justice system and how it works, policing and over-policing of Black and brown communities, and then seeing this other angle of climate and thinking, and the frustration, as I said, of climate, as if it's just to do with climate, not to do with everything else and how everything is interconnected. So what we've been saying, it's not enough to just care about climate. People are working on climate, which obviously now seems to be like, yeah, there's a huge sway and people understanding that there's also still a frustration that people are now taking action because it's now impacting, it's reaching the shores over here, and that's why suddenly there's paying attention. But seeing the interconnectedness of people who are migrating, who are forcefully displaced off the land because of the drought, of the famine, of the political violence, of the wars, and the foreign policy and things like that, who then come here and are faced by this kind of walls and injustice over injustice over injustice. So we work, I was kind of knowing all of this, but then frustrated that, hey, how are they not seeing this? How are people not really recognizing these patterns and interconnectedness? So, and as you see, you kind of like, if you don't see, and the effort that is being, as I said before, of let's have Black and brown faces in a room just to kind of tick a box and tokenize it. So for me, there was a real drive of, we're not just doing this and to address the surface level and to tick a box. We really need to get underneath, and to get underneath is to understand, for example, the detention, the deportations, the fact that the corporations who are kind of, especially now talking about COP26, who are now giving lip service and also funding and they're also doing the damage over there. So so the highlight was being able to, if I can understand it, I would like other people to get, but it's also, so not just for us to jump into the climate conversations, we want the people within the climate conversation to jump across and join us in the battles, in stand in solidarity and push back against, like I said, the migration policy, to understand the prison, the criminal justice system, the policing, to understand the technology and how it's being used against, you know, Black and brown communities and migrant communities and poor communities. It was that drive that's pushed me and kind of and others around me, because I feel I'm still learning in this. I'm still, but I'm very lucky to also have people around me who are more versed in kind of, for example, in the climate. So the ability to share and exchange in terms of what we know, including campaigning, organizing tactics, has been one that's been quite useful. But yeah, my journey begins from there and seeing what my family went through and my grandparents, how everything was kind of recycled and everything is reused. And then we come here and I see the waste in this society, and thinking also how I seeing that connection of, we talk about consumerism as a biggest driver for me still of climate, but we're not even addressing that because there's wealth here. So wanting to bring those conversations together was the driver. But yeah, but I'd like to hear about Ash too.
I mean, I agree with everything you're saying, Penny, of course. Like, I think that I mean, one of the things, I mean, I feel like there's a few different kind of ways into the kind of question you're asking, TJ, because like on the one hand, like everyone's talking about, it feels to me like everyone's talking about climate justice now, you know, I mean, you know, you could be the head of like a multinational investor corporation and still talk about climate justice, or you could like run a far right national organization and talk about climate justice. So I mean, you've got to listen very carefully, and like and actually all of those people want people look like me and Penny to come and like diversify their platforms, and so so we're both very active, and the groups that we're working with are very active in like going, I mean, we'll come and we'll talk, but like the work is about understanding the nature of this crisis. It's about going deep into the roots of it. I mean, so Wretched of Earth, we talk about 500 years, and actually for me, when you're saying how did we come into it, because I think I might have said like that it was kind of race and first, and then that kind of climate story came later, but actually afterwards I thought that was probably simplifying it, because actually whenever you're active for racial equality, you're actually active you're active against environmental racism. So when I was I was active around 2012-13 in the West Bank in Palestine, and we were kind of mobilizing and organizing around the Jordan Valley, where Bedouin farmers were being displaced because of a water crisis that was manufactured by the Israeli occupation, pulling the water out from underneath the ground. That the tropes of that, the dynamics of that, are the dynamics of the climate crisis. So that becomes a grounding in understanding the frameworks of climate breakdown and the geopolitics of climate breakdown. Before that, I'd been active in tribal Gujarat, where Narendra Modi, current Chief Minister of India, but then current Prime Minister of India, then Chief Minister of Gujarat, was displacing hundreds of thousands of tribal residents of India in pursuit of big dam projects, so or infrastructure projects that were all part of an economic growth story that fundamentally was about providing a return on the investment put in by Goldman Sachs and investment banks in London and New York. So all of these tropes, the changing weather is just a symptom along that pattern, and actually the story that we attempt to educate people on and to organize around is about understanding the continuity of that story, that the construction of this modern world, this globalized order over hundreds of years, has followed a consistent pattern in which the climate breakdown that we currently face is a symptom, not a is a symptom, only a symptom. So yeah. There was a different point that I also wanted to make, though, which was on the one hand that's familiar, and on the other that actually the journey for a race activist is also the journey of a race activist into a concern with the environment, a concern for the environment, and a concern for the kind of the greater ecology that connects us all, and connects us beyond like the human realm, like to the planet that sustains us. It has been a journey, that is a journey that I can trace, a journey in which I have gone from thinking of my liberation in terms of my own identity and my community and my ethnicity to one that connects me to the fate of this of my species and beyond, to and that the journey into climate justice and into environmental justice, it is for every activist. Like it's the great counterpoint to this idea of diversifying the platform of white power. It's like climate justice is the path to my greater liberation.
Paulo or Mo, you want to go?
Yeah, I have I have many questions. First of all, thank you for being with us, Pen and Ash, and it's really great to have this meeting and being able to discuss and hear from you. I guess I have many stuff here that I took notes, and maybe I'm going to talk very briefly about two of them. To the last point of Ash, when he says, even the corporation is talking now about climate justice, I would ask if, climate justice is becoming the new sustainability, what was sustainability in the 90s, and how it was co-opted by these corporations and became a kind of void concept. I wonder how you would reflect in this sort of quote unquote institutionalization of climate justice that is maybe coming now with the new COP, and how we as activists can sort of avoid that those terms, which are our political agendas, avoid that they are being co-opted. So I think that's one question maybe. And the other one, of course, for us here at the Climate Collective, from very early on, we have been, instigated and interested to learn from how the questions of reparation enters into the agenda of climate and environmental justice, right? Maybe, in the 80s, in the 90s, of course, there was a lot of social movements involved, but the idea of, fixing the climate was very much, looking towards the future, a transgenerational future, right? That one would need to fix. But it seems now, around different corners, that we are realizing that, sort of to fix the climate, we need to repair the violence of racial capitalism and colonialism, right? We cannot, let's say, change the future of the planet Earth if we don't, repair the legacies of those types of violence. And I know that Penny just mentioned the questions of reparation, and that in the letter of Wretched of Earth, you mentioned reparation very upfront. And just roots, the wretched of the earth are, of course, not only the humans, right? We can also consider that the non-humans, all the species with which we live, are also the ones who are the wretched of the earth. And there's something very beautiful in one of the texts of the Racial Justice Network, which is Mamadi Ujaje text, when she did a provocation on the 13th recommendation, when she acknowledged, all the other beings and ancestrals beyond the human environment, which are also part of this, let's say, trans-species political collective, and therefore the reparation, must acknowledge not only the violence against humans, but also the intersectionality between the violence against humans and the sort of non-human communities. So I just want to throw this. I don't know if it makes sense the way I'm kind of like outline those ideas, but I think this has been something important for us that we have been discussing with other activists and participants in this conversation. So it'd be great to hear from you, Ash and Penny. What are your thoughts on questions of reparation?
You going first, Penny? Hey. Oh, okay. So I mean, reparation is like, is where we're at. Like it's actually what's missing from the. So I mean, certainly in terms of Wretched of the Earth now, everything that we're doing is in the name of a reparations collective. The work is how do we build consensus around that, across the climate movement. How do we make that understood as not some controversial, kind of impossible dream, but like the basis of any kind of equitable and sustainable future. And I also, like, for what it's worth, my kind of exploration of the conversations going on at the intergovernmental level or in governmental departments. I mean, it's also, climate finance and the inability to actually understand like the huge discrepancy between the kind of level of commitment that governments are putting forward. You know, currently the G7 leaders are saying they'll come good on $100 billion a year, which is a promise that was made 12 years ago. In that time, the cost of loss and damage, you know, the cost of loss and damage alone, you know, the reparation bill, not for the last 500 years, but just for the last 12 months, is like $150 billion a year, right? So like, I mean, there's a paradigm shift that needs to happen, you know, towards justice, of which a kind of a logic, a principle of reparation is the only way in which that can happen. In terms of your first question about language, I mean, to be honest, I think that we worry too much about when our words are being co-opted. We kind of imagine that we lose something when our words are being co-opted. Our words are co-opted because they're the truth, because they signal a truth, and every time our words are co-opted, the ball is in our court. You know, we should take that as a sign of our ascendancy, and we should proceed. You know, we should continue to lay claim to the authority that lies behind those words, because it's that authenticity that scares the shit out of them, you know?
I want to be worried about the words or our words being co-opted, because I feel like what tends to happen is they not just become everyday use, but they also lose some of the meaning, the radical meaning and the origins that they come from. So it's a question that we have constantly about as an organization, of either seeming to be invited, for example, to certain spaces and to get to a point where you almost been assimilated into that space to become part of this the system, part of the outfit. And I think Sivanandan, who kind of wrote around communities of resistance, really talks to this as well. So I feel like it's similar. They on one hand, we start off and then people like, hey, we don't want to hear that. And then one way of the system really making that thing less of an issue is they co-opt it. We've seen it with decolonizing, where everybody's now decolonizing, and they really don't even have like true meaning what colonizing is, to decolonize, but they co-opt it. Institutions are the fathers of, but also the biggest instigators, perpetrators of colonialism or coloniality, like universities, and they're all adapting it. And then suddenly you can't say anything because they've got it at the front and at the bottom of their tag saying we are decolonizing. And similar to even now when we've seen the Black Lives Matter, look how many statements and pledges went out in a way to say we're working with you, we're saying we're going to do this thing. So I do want to worry about, but I think the thing that we can do, those of us who kind of understand the true meaning and the origins of these terms and terminologies and also processes, is to keep taking them back to where it's from and what it's about, because that idea of becoming everyday usage in terms of language is part of the assimilation that they do. But I think on another level around kind of the reparations, and I really like kind of what Mama D says, and the fact that you kind of have reference to, and I'd like to also say to suggest to kind of look on the website, because I cannot do justice to some of the amazing people we work with by trying to summarize and bring in what they say and do, such as that Mama D's kind of highlighting of the hierarchy that exists of kind of humans seeing themselves on top of the trees, the water, and in charge of, and what they do by in charge of is just mess everything up. And some of recognizing even what we're seeing now as climate crisis is really the planet kicking off and saying enough is enough. You've done this and you've done that. So recognizing that too, and what we owe to the motherland, or to kind of in terms of reparations also being part of that. And secondly, we are also quite lucky to have Esther, who's our patron, who's kind of one of the key people around reparations and does a lot of work, including with EXA on reparations, with INOSA, with PACO, and kind of the language of reparations. What do we actually mean? And again, first it's a shock because people assume reparations. This is, again, I can't summarize it quick enough, but the assumption that reparations is to do with money. And I know we say the repair needs to be us also repairing as a community of the traumas and the harms that we've experienced, but there's a big part of giving back to what's been damaged too, and a big part of it is really around declaration of non-repeat. And I think what we are seeing and what we're asking of people working on climate, we're seeing repeat of those harms too, in terms of ignoring, invisibilizing, the continuing to extract and exploit. It's a repeat of. So the moment people have a good understanding of what reparation stands for and the statements that go with reparations, including not just the compensation, which is what people focus on, is the other stuff on non-repeats and almost apologizing for the damage that's been done, then there's more chances of people kind of coming at this a bit more holistic and in a way that ensures that there is a balance, or kind of this inequity that we have in terms of global south and the west, or global north and or the global majority. There's an awareness that means that we're bringing a sense of rebalancing of, and I think the way you were describing the question, Paolo, is I feel like perhaps this is also the moment with COVID and what we see in the pandemic do, and the reactions to as well, because I'm not sure whether Black Lives Matter would have kind of hit gone to the extent that they would have done had we not been locked up, and really kind of the anxiety and everything else that emerged from that, of people not being allowed to move, which some of us have not been allowed to move, the restrictions that came with the lacking control, because again, the West and the global North have kind of have, you can travel, you can do whatever you want, and then suddenly you can't get out, you cannot not put masks on, there's regulations that are put in and everybody goes in panic. Some of us have been living in these restrictions for however long we've lived in the restrictions, but I feel like it's also an opportunity for people who had no knowledge about all these interconnected issues to do it. This is the time, including people working on climate, to do the homework on how, because there's no way, and I don't know whether this is the rebalance that can come, that there's no way we can repair and do good in one part of the world and ignore the rest and expect that it's going to be fine. I think it's similar to a disease. You cannot, like, for example, even though we know the COVID stuff and how unequal, and they're refusing with the patenting and stuff. There's no way that they can say we only look after the communities in one part of the city and ignore the rest and expect that disease is going to stop. You're going to have to do something about the rest of it. And I feel in a way that maybe this is the time where we pay attention to everything else, but we do some learning as well for those people who are unaware, who don't understand even how we consume those flowers that you're sending and buying somebody. How much water do they consume? What part of the world are they coming from? And how much water do those people who are working in those flower plants, what do they earn? Who owns that land? When did that land get taken over? Similar to salads, to clothes, and you can buy clothes and dispose of them whenever. People having those very basic conversations, because I feel like this drive also for fossil fuel and it's kind of like targeting the government and the corporations, but we also need to look at ourselves in terms of how we're living, how we're existing, and take those steps too. And I think this is what is allowing the fact that not just the conversations that we're having, but to move away from just thinking of it as over there is the problem, we're also the problem, and what can we do? And that's the educating or and learning that we need to be doing ourselves.
Thanks for that. Thanks so much, Ashish and Penny. I'm quite struck by what you're saying, Penny, around kind of, you can't assume that you can fix something in a sort of small geography and that it has a broader impact. And the pandemic certainly shown us this. And I think this is often one of the things that can be quite sort of overwhelming about stepping into the space and engaging with the space of climate breakdown, is just the nature of scale. And Ashish, you were speaking about trying to move from this kind of more localized engagement to sort of intergovernmental engagement at sort of COP level. And yet it's just a requirement. No, we have to be able to move between the specificities of our local communities and this kind of mass scale of the planetary, the global at the same time. Both of you seem to be quite comfortable with the shift to some degree, working very much within either the context of your city, but also with quite specific localized issues and local community organizing, but then recognizing this need to connect at a global level, which of course the 13th recommendation or 13th framework calls on very strongly. I'd be interested to hear from both of you around learnings, challenges, kind of strategies for moving between these scales, and the ways in which the organizing you do creates sort of, I don't know, connections, networks, rhizomatic structures that enable the shift between the global and the local, or perhaps don't, where those kind of breakdowns might be. Particularly maybe Penny, if you want to start in relation to the 13th recommendation.
Yeah, I think I definitely recognize how overwhelming it could all be as well. It's like almost before we begin this, we need to learn this, and before we begin that too, we need to kind of learn this, and then it's like, okay, what do we do? Because I remember when the 12 recommendations were given, because we went for the meeting and we were listening to, I hope they've got internationalism, because this was what the climate commission in Leeds was going to do. We're like, I hope they've got what we said. And then we've heard that they didn't have it within the 12, which is why ours was the 13th. But what we've kind of seen said is like, it doesn't mean the 13th is actually, it's the beginning and the end of, it's the thing that the thread that holds all of them, all of the other recommendations that came through around electric cars and refusing like airport expansions and all of this. The 13th is the key one, and rather than seeing as a separate and doesn't sit in between. But one of the things when the challenge was posed, I think it was on social media, somebody said colonialism is too complex. Like we cannot bring colonialism in climate conversation, it's too complex. And I'm like, what do you mean it's too complex? Some of us we are aware of this, but it's the driver of, it's the subtle, it's the invisible hand that runs through everything because of how deeply ingrained it is in everything. So we cannot say it's too complex, therefore let's not look that way. And I think that's also the thing that we are aware of the kind of like, especially because it feels like a whole new lesson in learning. And that's why I feel like what I was saying before, we're not necessarily just saying we want to step in the climate, we want climate to step into the other spaces too. So I am currently doing a doctorate, and my focus or my topic is how coloniality shapes Black activism. And what I've kind of devised as tools of domination are 5 tools or pillars of domination, education being one of them, that we've been duped, we've been given the pillars, the way I see them, they reinforce each other. And if one kind of weakens and you tackle one, the other one stands up and brings it back up again. So the difficulty even with some of the work and organizing that we do is some of us are focused, for example, on policing and think, if we change that, we'll change everything. And actually, no, you can't. We need to kind of change everything all at the same time. So for me, so the education is one of them, religion, capitalism, violence. We're talking about colonial violence, but it's also the physical and the mental violence that comes with not just epistemicide, it's the ecocide, it's everything else that's come through as a result of this kind of white supremacy, but also everything else that sits around and underneath it. So it's understanding that we have to tackle and change all of this too, which is why for me, even the language around decolonizing is peculiar in terms of who's saying it and who says they're doing it. But coming back to how, because we are, because of the history, it also means that the people who are here, or those of us, we kind of have all these roots that are international. So I was lucky enough to be part of people who are kind of invited to Brazil, a conference like twice with over 100, each time over 100 women who are acting or kind of in activism. And some of the people were there were people from the Amazon, people from the Quilombo communities, people from, from Latin America for sure. And this is why I'm hearing also, not just for the first time because I've seen it, but I'm meeting and I'm engaging and sitting across tables from people telling you what the damage is, like what needs to be done. Because it's like almost like, what do you want me to do? What do you want me to do in terms of we're here and we're all parting? They're saying, we want you to take this message message where you go. And again, because of my own history, as I said, my own roots, and also a lot of friends that I have around me, that idea of kind of global, local, international is something that we cannot avoid, we cannot step away from. And I feel like as long as we recognize and we are aware of all this, what we're saying about arms trade or foreign policy, corporations who kind of taking over land, as long as we have sight around this and some knowledge around this, then and I think as overwhelming as it feels, as long as people are taking small steps, whether it's learning or taking charge or kind of stepping into another space that's not even your sphere, I feel like we can do something about it, rather than thinking we're just going to address climate and leave everything else as it is, including, you know, because everything is interconnected. We say around health, around employment, around, because the racial capitalism is as it is. So I feel like also having an anti-capitalist way of thinking, because right now, even with the COP26, there's almost a thing around, it's fashionable to be a climate justice person or climate justice organization, and in a way they're mainstreaming it as well, which is kind of the question that Paolo was asking before. So and if we're also moving that, we're reinforcing those powers that still, because capitalism is about taking advantage of others. So if we're kind of moving towards that, we need to kind of have a way or create alternatives that mean that we can be anti-capitalist and be anti-racist and be pro, you know, climate, these things, and all of the other oppressions too, not just kind of anti-classist as well, because the class thing also affects communities here, whatever ethnicity they are, in terms of damage and not traveling, but somehow they're facing pollution, they live in cities or areas that are kind of deprived, and, you know, local councils don't bother and all of that stuff. So it's being aware in those ways, but it means the people losing some of their privileges too, or willing to give away some of their power as well. So it's not enough to just say, oh, okay, and I'm going to go tie myself to, you know, something and kind of make a talk. It's being beyond that in terms of how we live right now, because I think what we're seeing is it's a crisis, and things need to change drastically and quite quickly. And that also means the lifestyles that we're living and the way we exist right now needs to change. And people have to be willing to do that, not just point fingers at somebody or something else as a problem. We're also part of the problem, and thinking, how can we do to repair not just the climate as climate, the social justice issue in terms of everything else that's kind of connected to it.
Thanks, Penny. Ash, I don't know if you have any additional thoughts on this kind of, I mean, you mentioned this idea of your own individual liberation shifting to the liberation of your species and beyond. No, that's quite the kind of mind-blowing scale. Any thoughts around this kind of moving between these scales, the local and the planetary?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is, like, I think your question, Malema, is the question of the, you know, it's the question that sits, you know, beneath any kind of inquiry into this kind of intersection of climate justice or race and ecology. You know, yeah, I mean, where have we got? I mean, I think so. One, yeah, I think that to meditate on the planetary and the interplanetary, you know, is you know, is pretty much like a kind of foundational activity in this, because you know it's through that sense of scale that we might start to understand what the network, you know, what the networks are that we need to be building and organizing and, you know, surrendering to, actually, because they already exist. I think that I mean, you know, I mean, just in terms of like methodologies, I mean, so I mean, when I'm hearing, I really do agree with everything Penny says, but actually when you sort of talk about like decolonization, I also think that, you know, like decolonization is also like a really like complicated, like, you know, it's also a question as much as it is a program, you know, that is, and so you know, like, I think that really thinking about like the system that we all suffer underneath, you know, that kind of isolates us, and that that cuts us off from one another and cuts us off from what's real. You know, like how do we like that is the universal experience of our time. This system, you call it empire, call it neoliberalism, call it capitalism, you know, and so, you know, for me, that kind of, I guess, you know, so certainly with the symposium that we're kind of doing at the end of the month, I mean, the decolonial methodology that we're kind of putting forward, which I think is also about kind of a strategy for bridging the local and the planetary, you know, like it's, you know, start off with acknowledging the ecologies of empire that exist all around you, you know, whether that's in, you know, the way that the landscape around you has been organized, or the way that you relate to your boss, or your boss relates to you. They're all part of an ecology of empire, and the ability to acknowledge that seems to me a kind of starting point. The possibility of sensing a planet and a planetary scale that lies beyond empire's ecology seems to me like a great step too, and to see the possibility of organizing as a kind of futurism, and of futurism as, you know, as a kind of organizing, you know, the imagination and this great network that we long to be a part of, you know, like are, you know, like two sides of the same coin. It seems to me that they're in that are some sort of broad coordinates for bridging the local and the planetary. But I also think it's like it's the experiment of our time. It's like it's our generation's call to, you know, discover and manifest the strategies that will do that, you know.
I love that proposal, Ash, in terms of an imperative, a contemporary like world-making imperative to sense a planet beyond ecologies of empire. That's really amazing, I think. I had a question that kind of relates to that. This term hostile environment has come up earlier, and people may not know what that refers to specifically. It's actually, from my understanding, it's a policy directive of the conservative British UK government directed at discouraging migration by producing this hostile environment, particularly within the larger climate, but the larger climate of Brexit Britain and its emergent ethno-nationalism, say. It's also a striking way that environment basically weaponized as an instrument of population control, with all sorts of racializing and xenophobic implications, even suggesting eco-fascist tendencies. So I'm wondering, could you say more about that context within Britain and how you see it impacting communities, this policy of hostile environments? And then also maybe in relation, like how can we sense a planet, or how can we sense communities and experiences beyond that kind of ecology of empire? So that's the question for Ash or Penny.
Yeah, the hostile environment and yeah, it was kind of devised by, or kind of at least enacted by Theresa May when she was Home Secretary, who then became Prime Minister. And it was making the environment as hostile as possible for migrants. And it was kind of a whole list of things and areas or facets of society that meant the conditions of people coming and migrating to the country come here and they don't like it to the point that they want to leave. And there was a few things. So for example, employment. So people going through the asylum process are not allowed to work and therefore live on something like £5 a day, which is given by the government and housed by the government. But again, if the case is refused, you're also made destitute and you're still not allowed to work, but you're out there in the streets. And if you're caught working, it's illegal and therefore liable to be detained and deported. So in a way, it's hard and between a rock and a hard place. And similar to, which is kind of now becoming even more real with the health. So health, the national health is free for everybody at point of kind of contact. But what they've created is now charging people who not only kind of have migration history, for example, people, students and stuff, who pay like a nominal amount, but again, people who are seeking asylum and refused cases, they are charging them. So we've got pending cases, like one kind of quite local called somebody called Simba, who has over 100,000 bill to pay because of I think it's to do with his kidneys. And we've had similar situations with people who come here under the Windrush, again, people who came here to help the country grow, and then suddenly the documents were lost, and then they kind of told they're illegal. And then when they've gone in and they've had ill health and they're being treated, they're being charged for. Again, this is very separate. So everybody else enjoys, which is kind of how we kind of say everybody else gets to enjoy certain benefits. But if you're a migrant, or if you're going through the asylum system, your treatment is completely separate, which is kind of like the whole segregation point. And then same thing goes to housing. So if you go to seek accommodation, the landlords are being now, which is kind of what we were saying about them being weaponized to become the Home Office, is they're being asking people to prove their identity and they have rights to be here and report them. Similar to schools, education establishments, check your documents, and if they find that you're not supposed to be here, they report to the Home Office. And similar to driving license, if they check you're not allowed to, and if they check and they find you're not supposed to be here, report you. And same goes to, I can't remember the final one. So what essentially the hostile environment has done is made everybody border force and looking out for the Home Office, and made the environment very fearful and it's, again, for communities who've migrated. And this is, and again, policing, and this is one connects with one of our campaigns called Stop the Scandal, that we're talking about technology that's been devised and rolled out nationally. That means when the police stop you and you've got migration history and you have your fingerprints in the Home Office, they can find out, and they can also hold you for that reason, or contact the Home Office. So in a way, it means anybody who has migration history, it's very, very unfair, and not in terms of how you live and how you expect to live, you stand out too. So you're not allowed to study, again, because unless you're doing grade 1 or English level, you're not allowed to study whilst you're waiting for your case. And now we've worked with people who've been here 15 years, 17 years, appealing back and forth. And in that time, they're just staying in an accommodation, £5 a day, not allowed to do many, many things. And the accommodations that they live in, they have no televisions, they have no internet, they have one plate, one, cup, one, whatever. And people are expected to live like this. So this is kind of part of the hostile environment. And what we're saying, it keeps extending. And part of the challenge and the resistance we're asking people to do is to not be complacent, because that person who's sat in a desk in a university or school, they're asking for your ID, they're being complacent. They say it's not me, it's the government that says it. But how about communal, or kind of all of us resisting together, as opposed to a few of us who feel and say that we need to be standing alongside and not allowing for this kind of draconian policies to continue. So that's kind of what the hostile environment, maybe Ash can add a little bit more. But what's even worse now with, again, talking about politics of representation, what we have is Priti Patel, who's a brown woman sitting in position, and now the bill that they're trying to push through and pass through is even worse. That if you arrive in the country, so some of the reasons why people arrive through the Mediterranean on the back of lorries is because they shut down the channels of people to legally cross over when they're kind of fleeing the country. So people find ways, and people will traffic them and pay to get here. And when they come here, they seek asylum, and then the process begins. Now they want to make it illegal that if you arrive here through channels that they've not opened up for you, you either put straight into detention, and also now can be transported, a bit like Australia does, puts you in an island, or is creating contracts with countries, other countries, to say that they will get hold of you and take you there and deal with your asylum application whilst you're on an island. And then if you're successful, which we know they say no to majority of the cases, if you're successful, then you're allowed into the UK, or you're held in centers, which means you're not allowed to integrate, you're not allowed to kind of mingle and go out and about because of your status until they say you're successful, and then you're allowed. So there's things like that then, and kind of making it illegal. If you come, it's illegal to arrive through other channels. So the fact that they're doing this on top of shutting channels of safe arrival, safe travel, means we're getting even worse. So what we had as a hostile environment might even look, what we have now is almost hostile environment on steroids, which is a worry and a concern. And the fact that all of this is happening at the same time as when we're kind of talking about freedom of movement and freedom of whatever else. So it's a worry and a concern. And a way to counter it, I'd still go back to looking for, maybe this is the last point, of ways and ways of living that are not, because we've seen what capitalism done to the planet, and capitalism is around individualism, is around, you know, amassing wealth as an individual, as a family, and passing it on. We need to go back to kind of the more humane and humanity ways of living, which for me, one of them is kind of Ubuntu, which is a South African concept or way of doing things, where we kind of talk about I am because we are, and we are because I am, because this idea of, and collectives care capitalists, I think, and this is why they've shut down a lot of channels. But if we can go back to ways of living that are more around community oriented, looking after each other, even the mental health aspect of things that we have right now would go down. So I feel like if we can try and find ways and borrow from the people, or at least learn from the people who have ways that are connected to the land but connected to each other, that might be one way of going forward, rather than try and turn or utilize capitalism, which is poised to make it work for the society that we live in right now.
Thank you so much. Ash, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I mean, first of all, I just want to say that, like, you guys have been like really great company. I mean, the quality of these questions is like top, and, you know, like, I feel like you know, it's rich, and we're really pointing towards some of the really important questions that of this moment, you know. So thank you. And, you know, TJ, when you put this question about, you know, the specific context of the UK right now, I guess, you know, like, I mean, it feels sad in my heart, you know, like the question is, like, how do we reckon with this latent fascism in contemporary Britain? And actually, but I'm also aware, like, you know, for Paulo in Brazil and Malemo in South Africa, and for you, TJ, in the USA right now, you know, we're all experiencing this same pain, you know, like this ascendant fascism, which, like, threatens to shape, you know, the course of the 21st century. So, like, you know, what's going on in Britain, which I think is probably what's going on for all of you as well, it is, I think, this question of this is where I'm at with it. Like, these ecologies of empire are undigested. They are the unconscious matter that, like, is around us, or, you know, is just completely, is the structure which we're all inhabiting. So we think that we're in nature, but we're not. We're in white supremacy. Like, it's literally shaped by the hedgerows, by the, you know, by the door handles, you know, like, and so, you know, we're so out of joint in that sense, you know. How do we sense the planet? How do we return, you know, how do we redeem ourselves and return to some sort of planetary existence? Like, only through culture. Only culture can redeem us. Only culture can save us. And it's sort of the role of artists now to disrupt, to see that invisible structure that is so ubiquitous, you know, that system, to see it, to disrupt it, to, you know, to recreate a new world, you know, to create in whatever, you know, in a Zoom call, in a dinner party, in a Sunday session, you know, at your local bar, you know, like, but like, just to keep sowing the seed of that decolonial future through culture, and to water it and to nurture it and to make it grow and to understand what it needs to survive, you know.
Absolutely, and yeah, I agree. These are the most important questions, and I think also that culture, the arts, are what we need most of all to help us address these questions and figure out new ways to sense the planet beyond hostile environments and ecologies of empire. I'm just thinking about the time. We should start to probably begin to wrap it up, but I want to ask Paulo or and Molemo if they have any maybe last questions.
Thank you, everyone. It has been really amazing to be part of this conversation. I totally agree. Maybe that's not a question, it's just to throw it out there, because Ash was just talking about it, and my notes here close with this question of culture, as you mentioned, the importance of culture, the importance of imagination, how to imagine a different political future. And Penny, you gave a very interesting example about the flowers, I remember, right? When you are giving flowers to someone, how can you recognize where those flowers came from, the amount of water that were put in the production of this water, whose hands have taken care of these flowers, right? So in a way that you are aware of this imperial ecology, but at the same end, this allows you to sense a planet otherwise. And Penny mentioned the question of pedagogy, the question of education, the question of unlearning, and Ash just mentioned, political imagination, the sort of role of culture of seeding, the sort of future otherwise in your everyday sort of practice. Yeah, I just want to leave this comment. It's not a question, but I think, somehow you arrive, Ash, at the end of the conversation in something that I was also like taking notes and kind of thinking that's totally crucial. And I think like in Matt's Climate Collective, we have been discussing a lot the role, the political role of, imagination and arts and culture in sort of, shaping this future otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I don't have sort of, in the interest of time, too many other questions, but a big thank you to Ashish and Penny for sharing the great work you do and kind of the strategies and approaches you've been undertaking, and maybe to echo the last couple of comments and sort of reference the upcoming discussions. We will be kind of having more conversations with artists around some of this imagining process, which I think, as Ashish has so aptly put forward, is this kind of really generative space of reimagining ways forward. That's also, I suppose, about sort of emergence from this crisis positionality that is so well positioned in the open letter that Wretched of the Earth wrote, that thinks about new strategies of being that I think are really exciting. So thank you again to Ashish and Penny, and really looking forward to kind of continuing the conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Mo, and Paulo, also for joining us with this conversation, which has really been amazing and I think very inspired. I do have one last question. Maybe Ash, you can address it. Like in terms of the upcoming COP26, this is of course the 26th UN summit over more than 2 decades, and we, as they've continued year after year to make these promises based on, of course, non-binding agreements, the climate conditions globally have just gotten worse steadily year after year. So I'm wondering, what can we expect? What do you think we can do? What is, in terms of your involvement with the COP coalition process? What do you think we need to do about this? And yeah, I mean, we're all looking at the COP process, the UN Climate Summit, as the place for global climate leadership. Yet it's been arguably just inadequate at best, even a really tragic failure at worst. So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on the upcoming climate summit?
Yeah, I expect very little from it, and I won't be investing a huge amount of my time in engaging with it. But I will, the weekend before it, be convening some of the artists, thinkers, activists that I care most about to continue the work of imagining a just future.
Yeah, Thank you. And thank you both, Ash and Penny, for this amazing conversation. I'd like to also thank the team at Mott, particularly Bea Leanza, the director, whose initiative has brought all this together and made this conversation possible, as well as the work of Matilda and Nuno with all the technical elements. So thank you to everyone. It's been a real pleasure. I look forward to following both Ash's work with Wretched of the Earth and Penny's with Racial Justice Network in the future. And take care, everyone. Thanks for joining us.